Okay, our next topic in this lesson on ideology is about mood. And we're discussing this because people's mood, the general mood of society, is an important driver of social affairs. And I'm going to start by putting up various quotes and observations to the effect that society runs largely on emotions rather than on rational thought. Okay, so here are various observations that all make the point that society is driven by emotion. So Brooks Adams, who's a theoretical historian around the year 1900, he was grandson of the US President John Quincy Adams. He said that when unexpected events occur, people act on instinct, and it's only later that they reflect on what they have done. And then Pareto, who he met in the mathematics module with his work on power laws in the statistics of people's income distributions, he made a similar point that people act on emotion and then they engage in post hoc rationalization, that is, looking backwards and rationalizing what they've done to provide a logical explanation for their behavior. So, they're explaining why they did what they did, but that logic wasn't there at the time. It was just an emotional response. And these aren't largely exact quotes, by the way. They're just paraphrases of the points people are making. But this is an exact quotation from a paper by Peter Turchin and others. They said, semiotic emotional clusters are powerful triggers of social breakdown and recovery. So what they're saying is that it's certain symbols and the emotions they arouse. So symbols like flags, anthems, slogans arouse emotions that are the powerful triggers of social breakdown and recovery. I think that part's fairly straightforward. So it's the emotions that these symbols arouse that cause people to behave, say, in destructive ways, causing society to break down, or to become more peaceful and cooperative and allow society to recover. Cesare Marchetti, who's an Italian theoretical historian, in one of his papers, he says, society is moody. And he gives various examples to illustrate his point. One is the ratio of murders to suicides in society. So this doesn't remain constant over time, but it fluctuates up and down. Sometimes there are more suicides relative to murders, and sometimes there are fewer suicides relative to murders. So whether people are murderous or suicidal is a reflection of mood and emotion. These things are driven by emotion. The philosopher David Hume similarly said that emotion not only overrides reason, but that is how it ought to be. So the point he's making is that we can't decide by reason what we want to do. It's emotion that provides the motivation for behaviour. So we can't work out rationally whether we want a piece of cake. That's an emotional desire or not desire to have the cake. In general, what happens in society is driven by our emotions, by our feelings, what we want and desire, and reason is in the service of that. It may be useful to help us work out the best way to achieve what we want, but it's our feelings that drive social behaviour. And then Jim Penman says that society is mainly driven by the mood of the youth generation. And that's because the youth generation is the most vigorous and also has the least investment in the status quo. So because it has little investment in the status quo, the youth generation is quite happy to change society, and it has also got the most vigour to bring about that change. So the direction society takes tends to be driven by the wants, feelings, emotions, mood of the youth generation. And that's particularly going to be the case in times of rapid social change, because as we've saw with Margaret Mead's ideas on generation gaps, is when society is changing rapidly that the older generation gets the least respect and has the least prestige. And so the 1960s, for example, were a time of rapid change around the world. And that's when there were youth movements, student riots in Europe and in America, and also in China. It's perhaps not a coincidence that it was at the same time as students were rioting in France, say, that in China the Cultural Revolution was seeing the youth displacing the older generation. Okay, now we're going to consider the autonomy of mood. So what do I mean by that? Well, it means that social mood evolves under its own steam. It's not driven by external factors. Mood feeds on itself and changes according to its own dynamic. And this is a point particularly made by the mathematician John Casti, who's written a book on social mood called Mood Matters. And one of the things he provides to illustrate that point is about how the American stock market was hardly affected by the assassination of JFK in 1963. He argues that stock markets are a good indication of social mood because when people are optimistic, the economy does well, the people spend money, and if they're optimistic, they think the future's rosy, so they're prepared to invest in shares, and so the stock market does well. And when their mood is depressed, they're not confident about the future, then they sell up, they keep their money to themselves, they don't buy things, and so the stock market declines. So let's just have a look at his chart of the stock market around the relevant time. So here is the chart of the Dow Jones index from 1956 to 1966. And he initially puts it up without those dates and says, well, can you identify on this chart where was the assassination of President Kennedy? And then he shows you where it was. It was actually about there. The assassination of JFK. So you can see that in terms of the mood, as the social mood in the US as represented by the stock market, that seems to have no reflection of the assassination of JFK. And yet you might have thought that a shocking event like the assassination of JFK would affect social mood. It might make people fearful or depressed, but in fact it has seemingly no effect. So this chart here is showing the evolving mood in the US over that 10-year period, and it is evolving by its own logic. It's going up and down, the mood is changing, but it's not affected by external events, or at least it's not affected by the assassination of President JFK. And since that was one of the most high-profile events of that period, and that doesn't affect it, then we can gauge that it's not really being driven by external events. And another related point he makes is that there's a tendency to think that things like and change of party in an election, in a general election, the change of which party is in power, or a popular film, that these things can affect the popular mood. It certainly often seems like that. For example, in Britain in 1997, after a long period of Conservative rule, the Labour Party under Tony Blair came into power, and Tony Blair, a younger Prime Minister, and there was felt a change in the mood of society, which had been quite depressed in the later years of the Conservative government. Now there was a new mood of optimism, and or similarly, a popular film can, seems to have an effect on people and change the mood of society. But Casti says that's an illusion. Actually, it's the other way around. The reason the party changes is because society's mood has already changed. People in 1997, at the time of the general election, their mood had changed, and that is why they voted for this new party. And they felt optimistic about what they were doing. And the reason the film is popular is because it captures what people are feeling already. So these things, they reflect and they don't drive mood. That is, for Casti, a very fundamental point. And he bangs on about it in his book because he says that he's always going around telling people this, but he encounters tremendous resistance. People say, "Oh, well, that can't be true. It's not that way round. It feels like it's the other way." But not as far as I'm concerned. I think he if you read his book, he's very compelling about this idea that it is that mood is changing for rather mysterious reasons of its own, and it's mood that affects what happens in society, not what happens in society that affects people's mood. The theoretical historian Geoffrey Blainey similarly talks about how fashion can be a good predictor of economic events. Fashions in clothing, but also in music, people can study that to predict how mood is changing and how that's going to affect the economy, and it seems to work better than economic models. There's a famous thing, the lipstick measure, that when lipstick sales go up, it suggests that the economy is worsening, and the argument being that lipstick is something cheap that women can get that can sort of lift their mood. So they're not wanting to spend a lot of money, but they are wanting to try and boost their mood. So lipstick sales go up when the economy is going down, or at least about to go down. So the social mood is changing, at least among women, and it's reflected in lipstick sales, and it's then forecasting how society and the economy, which is a key part of society, is going to change. But there are people who argue that external circumstances do affect mood. Let's see some examples of how external circumstances affect mood, which is that basically people's attitudes change between boom and bust. So when the economy is booming, people seem to favour small government and deregulation of the economy. And when the economy is declining, in a bust, they're more in favour of big government, regulation, and welfare programs, which kind of makes sense that when the economy is declining, then people feel that they've got more to gain from supporting big government and welfare because they expect to do better out of it. If they're afraid that they might lose their jobs, then strong welfare programs seem like a good bet. But if they're confident that the society is booming the economy is booming, then they're not really bothered about that, and they want to have as minimum tax burden as possible because they're at that time paying taxes. But I think here, we need to be careful about this, because you could also argue that it's small government and deregulation that actually allows the boom, and it's big government, over-regulation and hefty welfare programs taking value out of the economy that may be causing the bust. So, this is, well, with all these things about the interaction between mood and what actually happens, we do need to be careful, and it's probably an area where more research is needed. But Casti would say that it's this mood that creates those economic conditions, not the other way around. Okay, now we said that mood evolves according to its own mysterious logic, but there are people who think that they actually know what drives mood, and it's something called the Elliott wave. So what the Elliott wave looks like is this. You start with something shaped like that, a long up and a shorter down, and then you substitute for the longer up 3 peaks. It goes up, down, up, down, up. And for the down, this down here, you substitute a 2 thing, a down, and then a short up, probably more like that, then a shorter up, and then the down again. And you can then do this again. So for all these ups, we would again replace it with 3 peaks, and the downs with something like that, and so on for all the others. And they suggest that something like the stock market or the general mood of society is described by this what's in fact a fractal structure, that it repeats itself similar on different scales. And so it shows the short and long-term fluctuations in mood. So this might be 100 years or 1,000 years, and then this might be a decade of up and down, and then there would be monthly changes within it. So it applies on all scales and provides this long-term and short-term description of fluctuations in mood. And what the people who are enthusiasts for this point out as well is it has a relationship to the Fibonacci series, which you should probably know, but is formed by each term in the series is the sum of the previous 2. So it starts 1, 1, and then 1 and 1 makes 2, 1 and 2 makes 3, 2 and 3 makes 5, 3 and 5 makes 8, and so on. And you get that in this Elliott wave. So there's 1 up and 1 down, and when they're put together they make 2. And then there is then here 3, down, up, down, that's 3, and here there's up, down, up, which is 5. And then you put those together and you've got 8 segments in all. And if you continued the construction, doing it, filling in the others, you then find that you had 13 here and 21 and so on. So it reproduces the Fibonacci sequence. And the Fibonacci sequence is found in organic processes, the arrangement of petals on flowers, for example, can show the Fibonacci series. So it's produced by organic growth processes, and that suggests that fluctuations in mood are also an organic natural phenomenon, insofar as they also show this Fibonacci series which occurs in nature. And so that would resonate with the ideas of someone like Jim Penman, who argues that social behaviour is driven by hormones, hormonal changes. So, he argues that it is a natural biological process. And although this sort of at first seems extremely unlikely that the mood is going to be take this shape as something so prescriptive, just blindly copying this shape and replacing it and replacing it and replacing it. Actually, Benoit Mandelbrot, who invented or discovered the idea of fractals, he found indeed that fractals are constructed like this are do explain well the stock market. So what he does is something like that. He has a basic shape, and then he replaces his basic shape with copies of itself, but what he does is do it at random. So in the construction I just gave here, we always replace up ones by that, and we always replace down ones by that. But with Mandelbrot, if you're going to replace this line with the basic shape, you can replace it by doing that, or so you go up then down, or you can go down then up. You can flip a coin and decide which is which. So what he found is that doing this construction certainly generates or reproduces the statistics that you find in real stock market charts much better than economic models do. But you can't use it in a predictive way, because there is this element of randomness. And similarly in the real world stock market, it's going to be random whether it goes up and down or down and then up. So it has that fractal structure, but there's a random element to it, and therefore you're not going to be able to use it to predict what the stock market's going to do, unfortunately. Okay, we're now going to consider the theory of George Soros, the investor, about an idea he calls reflexivity. And this perhaps gives us a bit more insight into the interaction between mood and the real world, and suggests that we don't have to go with Casti to insist that mood always comes before real world consequences and is not affected by real world consequences. And that we don't have to argue that, oh no, it's the real world events that come first and mood follows. We don't have to choose one or the other, but actually both operate, so that real world events affect mood, which affects real world events. So that is the basic idea of reflexivity. So what George Soros says is that there's reality out there, things are actually happening, and then there is our perception of it, what we think is happening. And so reality affects our perception. He calls this the cognitive function. So to some extent, our belief about what's happening is based on what is actually happening. But there is, as he puts it, bias. We're not really necessarily accurate in interpreting what is going on, and we can have a false picture of reality, a biased picture of reality that may be affected, for example, by our prejudices, what we expect to be happening. And then he says that our perception affects our behaviour or drives our behaviour, which then affects reality, because based on our perception we do things that change the reality. And he calls this the participating function. And he originally developed these ideas in the context of the stock market, which was what he was most interested in when he was trying to think about how the stock market behaves. And as we've seen, Casti says, well, stock markets are actually a good measure of social mood, so they reflect the general concept of mood. Now, so in the case of the stock markets, price is what measures perception, the price of a share of a stock market security. Its price reflects what people believe it is worth. So it is their perception of its value. And then the reality is what it's truly worth, which he calls its actual value. Or in the Soros's work using the stock market concepts, he calls it the fundamentals, but what something's really worth. But if we call that the value, that's the reality, what it's really worth, its actual value, and the price is what people are prepared to pay for it, which reflects what they think its value is. And the key insight then of Soros is that the price does not just reflect the value, but it also affects the value through this participating function. And that's the part that people perhaps didn't fully appreciate, Soros would say, before he developed his theory. That it makes sense that if a company is successful and so has a real value, then the price of its share would go up. But the idea that the price of its share can actually make the company more valuable is less obvious. But Soros explains that if a company has a good share price, then the banks think it's doing well, and so they're prepared to lend it money. And in lending it money, then that allows the company to invest and so increase its value in reality. So it works in both directions. And then we can refine the model a bit further by saying that, in fact, though, perceptions can feed on themselves because people listen to what other people are saying. So they hear other people's perceptions, and that changes their own perceptions, and doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the underlying reality. So perceptions feed on themselves, but so does reality. There are certain economic laws and things that affect how the economy evolves, and so reality is also evolving under its own steam. To some extent, it's not purely driven by people's perceptions. There are, real world constraints that affect what can happen. And this kind of feedback of perception, then, this can lead to sort of runaway growth or runaway mood processes, let's say. As perception feeds on itself, but because perception is connected ultimately to reality, then it will eventually, if it gets too far away from reality, undergo a reality check, and it will have to collapse back or move, at least to some extent, back towards reality. So these runaway mood processes, of course, are seen in the stock market manias. The most well-known one is the Tulipomania in the Netherlands in the 17th century, when people were trading in tulip bulbs and paying silly prices for them. But because the prices were going up, people expected them to keep going up, and so they were prepared to pay these very ridiculous prices, until eventually it got so far out of touch with reality that it couldn't go up anymore, and at that point the whole thing collapsed. So mood can exhibit these runaway processes that eventually end in tears. The dotcom boom of the late 90s is another well-known example. Okay, so we said that the youth generation, based on its mood, can change the direction of society. And that suggests a question of how much does it take to change the direction of a society? So specifically, how many people does it take to get a society moving in a particular direction? A society that perhaps initially doesn't care which way it goes. How many people do we need to steer it in the direction that they prefer? So this might be like an activist group that wants to wake society up to some problem and get society addressing and solving that problem, like climate change or whatever it might be. So we're going to consider a model of influence. So it's about how many people does it take to influence the direction of a society, or to change the direction of an indifferent population. So a population that to begin with doesn't really care, and you're the activist, you want to get your own way. How many does it take? So let's write that up. Okay, well, if our population consists of just 3 people, then if we assume that 2 of them choose what to do at random, so they're indifferent, they don't really mind, they'll just randomly choose one option or the other, then the third person, the other one person, will get their way 3 times out of 4. Because if, say, the choice, just to keep it simple, is between heads and tails, and this person wants it to be tails, then the only time they won't get their way is when these both choose heads. But so that will only happen 1 time out of 4, because the other times one will be heads and the other tails, one will be tails and the other heads, or they'll both be tails. So in all those situations, this one will be in the majority and will get their way 3/4 of the time. What if there are 20 people? Well, we then get into complicated maths, but I'm just going to give the results. In this case, it turns out that if there are 17 choosing at random, then but then a group that works together, so they're not choosing at random, they've got a certain thing, they want tails, and they're all going to vote tails, then it's enough, just 3, to get their way 3 times out of 4. So in a population of 20, you just need an activist group of 3 to always vote the same way, and they will be in the majority 3 times out of 4. And then we can write up a general formula for the number of activists, or what in the theory of Penrose, who developed this model of influence, he calls the resolute group. So the resolute group, NR, is given by, or to achieve a certain, to get their way a certain percentage of the time, it's K divided by the square root of NI, the number of indifferent people. And K, the constant, depends on the percentage that we want. So if k equals 1, that implies that these will get their way 84% of the time. So here it was 3/4 of the time, so k will have some value less than 1. I don't know what it is. It doesn't really matter. But the point is that whatever figure you choose for how the probability of getting your way, then that you put that in here, and that will give you the number of people in your activist or resolute group to ensure that you get your way that percentage of the time. Ni, so Ni, for example, in this case, Ni would be 17, and K would be whatever it is for 3/4, 75%, and then NR would come out as 3. So we can also say that the fraction needed to dominate the population, that fraction to dominate, and assuming that NR, the number of resolute people, is small compared to the number who are indifferent, so it's strictly on the bottom should be Ni plus NR, but assuming that NR is small, and as we can see here it tends to be small relative to the Ni, and that's even just for 20 people, but if we're talking about 1 million it will be very small compared to it. So that is NR over Ni, so that's going to be K over Ni root Ni, so which we could write as K over Ni to the 3/2. But the point is then that Ni appears on the bottom here, so the larger the group, the smaller the fraction needed to dominate that group. Let's write that up. The larger the population, the increasingly the smaller the fraction needed to dominate that population. That is, the smaller the fraction needed to steer the society in the direction it wants to go. But this fraction has to work as a block. They always choose the same thing, but the rest of the population is assumed not to care too much. Then we get this result.